Alright everyone, I'm Josh from Banner Night Stew, and today I'm going to be talking about Fire Arcane RAI. There's been a couple of people asking for the lists on these. These aren't the exact lists that we've been playing in the videos, but these are a pretty accurate representation of what I'd bring to a tournament nowadays. So obviously we're going to start out with the pretty standard Fire RAI package, being the Fire Spirit plus Stormseer. Next up we're going to have a Divine Relic of choice, being the Grand Crusader's Ring. Most decks kind of agree that there's not really any other choice, at least in the main deck. Most people are playing a Grail on the side for many different tricks, but for the most part, GCR is going to be your best option. Next up, we have a suite of 3 balls, 1 of each element. Now, depending on your meta, you could change this. You could make it more of a fire and wind, for example. If people aren't playing water, put this in the sideboard, and then you can bring something else in from the sideboard permanently in here, and just bring the water in when you need it. But for the most part, if you're going to a big tournament, the best thing to do is to just put all 3 in, and you might have a couple of dead cards in your game 1, but thank God the game's best of 3, right? Next up, we're playing Chalice of Blood. As you can see from the baubles, we definitely do need draw, and this is the best draw card that you have. However, it is conditional. There is a fun line you can do with this when you're playing cards like Creative Shock, because a lot of people will leave you at 18 or 19 just to make sure that you don't get a Chalice activation. So the best thing to do in that situation, if you know you're going to die next turn, because they're going to leave you at that point for a reason, Creative Shock, hit yourself for 2, just so you can draw an extra couple of cards. The damage is definitely worth it unless you absolutely know you can kill with that extra damage. Really good to push yourself to a Chalice turn. Next up is kind of a flexible spot, but I like to put the Tome of Sacred Lightning in here. We aren't running the Tome of Knowledge. That is in the sideboard, but it is not in the main deck. The reason we run this is because we really want to have a bit of filtering late game. Also does let you level up if you have the right cards for it, but normally we're using this just to filter out those cards, like if you get an extra Dungeon Guide, even a Creative Shock later on in the game, just to filter that away is really good. Yeah, it gives you the flexibility to just filter a bit later on. Next up we have our 2 defensive options in Safeguard Amulet and Viridian Protective Trinket. These are kind of meta dependent. If you know you're running into a lot of allies, then it may be worth swapping maybe the Safeguard out for a Tariff Ring, or swapping into a Tide's Proclamation if you're running into a lot of Merlins, even into Erupting, it's really good. But in the meta in OCE, it's really important. There are a lot of water players, and a lot of them are playing the Scepter of Lumia, which is why we want this Safeguard Amulet, as well as for the Erupting decks, which aren't as common anymore, but definitely with Merlin coming back, you do need the Safeguard. Viridian Trinket. Water decks will shut this deck down, seeing as when you go late game, you won't have a lot of cards in your hand. So Viridian is definitely relevant for those matches, and you're definitely going to be wanting to bring it out. Usually on the turns that you're going to go off, it'll just stop them, and a lot of times, depending on the water player, they might not have 5 cards up to play anything through a Viridian Trinket. So whenever you see they've gone 4 or below, it's a really good time to bring out Viridian Trinket. Next up, we have the core of the deck. So the first things first is our tried and true fire card that isn't going anywhere, Creative Shock. Running this at a 4-0, and yeah, this isn't going to change in any fire deck. You're going to run 4 of them. There's been a few rogue lists that don't, but realistically, it's just kind of a show-in. You're always going to be running it. Really, really good with Voltaic Sphere. Good in a mage deck to get an extra bit of 2 damage. Does let you kill some allies, plus a Dungeon Guide hit. So you can get a few ally clears with this, and it can be really relevant, but also just early game getting some filtering, getting some cards down. We don't run any floating, so normally you're going to want to be pitching fire to try and get the damage, or a Voltaic Sphere to get some value later on. Next up is the staple for level 3 decks, Dungeon Guide. We wouldn't be playing this deck without Dungeon Guides, because because the deck is a lot slower now, you are going to need the Dungeon Guides, and you definitely want to see them. If you don't have them, you can still play out wins, but it does make it quite a bit harder. This is definitely a deck where you want to be Dungeon Guiding to 3. Some decks you can get away with Dungeon Guiding to 2, forcing level 3, but in this deck you definitely want to be holding onto this to just do a level 2 to 3 push. Next up is my all-time favourite card in the game, Careful Study. The card feels really, really good to play. It giving you those 6 counters when you're at level 3, as long as you're level 8. Means that you are going to be able to get 2 cards. It puts you up a card. Really, really good. Allows you to set up a Power Overwhelming turn. Not that we run that in this deck particularly. Can be really good for that. Lets you do a lot of filtering and you can get a lot of value out of these, chaining them together particularly. Next up is our arcane sights. These cards are really, really good. They allow you to gain a level, draw a card. It's all you want. It's a cycle, it gains you a level, it does exactly what RAI wants to do. It would be definitely one of the best sights in the game. The card is really good when you go to level 3. If you're able to use this, push yourself to 3 counters because you hit 2 from RAI level 1. Push yourself to 3 counters, draw an extra card off that. You can really snowball turns like that. So yeah, Arcane Sight, classic, really, really good. Next up is our first kill spell. We have Fireball. Just the best finisher in Fire, in my opinion. Getting to do all that damage is insane for the cost and at fast speed as well. Just makes it really, really flexible, allows you to play around Blanches, Innovate Agilities, and any other sort of prevention, even other Spell Shield Arcanes. This card is really, really good. I'd recommend, since it is fast speed, playing all of your slow speed stuff like Arcane Blast, Erratic Bolts first, then using this to play around anything else that they try and do. It just gives you a little bit more flexibility and allows you to play around the Safeguard Amulets, depending on where they pop them. So yeah, Fireball, amazing. Last but not least, in the core of the deck, Arcane Blast. Now, like I just said with Fireball, better to play these earlier if you can, and obviously pushing yourself to level 11 would be ideal, but there are definitely times when you might only get to 9 or 10, even a bit lower, like 8, but these are definitely cards I would be okay with banishing 1, maybe 2 early on. I wouldn't try and banish too many more than that, but because we have Fireballs and Erratic Bolts in the deck, you don't need to worry too much about holding onto these, and what's more important is getting up to the correct level, or the deck just doesn't function at level 3. Alright, so now we're going to go into the cards which I would say are flexible in number, but definitely you need to have some amount of these in the deck. The first one is Voltaic Sphere. I've tried running this at different numbers. I've tried running it at 2, tried running it at 4. It really just comes down to preference. I really like 3 as a good middle ground. If I can't decide on 2, can't decide on 4, 3 just makes sense. Really, really good with Creative Shock. And since we are playing Arcane Disposition in the deck, it does actually give us a little flexibility with that as well and give us a little bit extra value. Obviously it works with any Arcane card. It works really well with Arcane Blast because you're technically making it cost 2 less since this goes into banishment. Really, really efficient card. Would recommend trying to discard with these with Creative Shock if you can. If you can't, it's not horrible to play it late, but realistically, if you have no Creative Shocks and you can't bitch it, probably just put it down to banish to level up. Next up is a card that I definitely would like to play 4 of, but I just don't think there's space in the deck, and that is Scry the Skies. This is a finisher almost in RAI because it allows you to set up to the point where as long as you have a draw that you can follow it up with, you're going to be able to, for the most part, put yourself in a really good position or win the game. You either want to use this to set yourself up to kill, draw a whole bunch of cards, and then play something defensive, or if you have no other choice, you've got nothing to kill, you have no lines to win the game, the best bet is to just dig to something that's going to save you. Dig to Spell Shields, dig to Peacefuls, dig to Resolute Stands. Next up is a 4 of in this meta, which is Spell Shield Arcane. Due to the variety of decks that we have in OCE, I think that there's no time when Spell Shield Arcane feels horrible. There are definitely times when it feels less good, especially into the ally decks, but playing into Merlins and Xanders and Rending Flames decks are really popular in OCE. I would recommend running Spell Shields. If you have a deck that has a lot of allies, it may be worth cutting 1 or 2 of these. It's usually worth having a few, but in allies decks where they're not doing as big of hits, this isn't going to generate you as much value as you can really get from it, and then you may be better playing in a few extra copies of cards like Vanish and Peaceful Reunion, which we aren't running it for us, we're running it through us. Next up is what I like to call the Try Not to Die package. So, first up is Vanish from Sight. Now, we all know RAI struggles into allies. It's definitely the biggest weakness of the deck, and what Vanish allows us to do is to go stealth mode. I do think it has the weakness of being vulnerable to Shimmercloak Assassins and Trained Hawks. However, it does for the most part still work as intended. You might take a little bit of damage, but it's still going to do what it needs to do. Next up is the Tilt All Allies Players card, Peaceful Reunion. Now, the reason we're running this at a 3 of instead of a 4 of is because it's a little bit more expensive and there's definitely times it can feel a bit clunky. For that reason, we're running it at 3. You could easily put this up to 4 if there's a lot of allies in your meta. For our meta, it's very variety, so we need to kind of cut a few cards here and there, so we've cut this down and we're just running 3. Next up is Resolute Stand. Resolute Stand we do run out of 4 of, mainly because it's a bit more flexible than the other 2. Having the ability to play it for free, and most of the time you're going to be turboing levels, so you're always, for the most part, going to be playing this for free. You're going to try and pay for it if you can, but playing it for free when you go to level 3 and you have 1 card in your hand, sometimes it's just going to need to use a Resolute Stand. Keep in mind that this works pretty well into the low to the ground wide ally deck, but going into Tenoris they can get above you with a heavy swing and plus a bulwark sword, so just bear in mind that there are decks that can push above this. So there's definitely times where you might want to play this early, hold on to a peaceful or a vanish from sight for later on, because they can stop the big attacks as well. Next up, we have our early game cards. Now this is a bit flexible, but I really like it. Fractal of Insight. This allows us to set up our hand and what we're going to be drawing, because we definitely need to be seeing things like Resolute, Peacefuls, and Vanishes, again because allies are so prolific, and even into other decks like Erupting we're going to want to see Spell Shields, so we're going to make sure that we put all of our extra ally damage to the ground, because we're not too worried about with Erupting, so we definitely want to be looking for those Spell Shields and make sure we have them for their big Erupting turn. This is a little bit flexible, and if there are more ally decks in your meta than there are anything else, then you could change up the Fractal, the Incendiary Fractal. However, I would say as a more flexible and safe option, Fractal Insight is a bit preferred. Next up is a fun spicy pick in Increasing Danger. Now, a lot of RAI decks are running this nowadays, however, I think it's a necessary evil, is the way I like to put it. Increasing Danger is a card that gives your opponent advantage as well. It does give you more, puts you up a card. However, there's a lot of faster decks than RAI at the moment. So I would probably recommend playing these only early game, and playing them late is definitely a thing you can do to try and get a little bit more extra value and trying to dig for answers. But for the most part, if you're playing this late, you're definitely digging, and I think most of your opponents will realize that you're grasping at straws. Next up is our Regalia Destruction for the deck, which is Disintegrate. This is a very flexible pick. If people are playing Domains, then you may want to swap this with a Meltdown. However, because Merlin's coming back quite a bit, I'd recommend Disintegrate. Your deck can play it for free in RAI, which is fantastic. Being able to kill any ally, any Regalia, really, really good card. Just bear in mind that early game it's quite a bit harder to play. So if you have this in hand and you need to get rid of something, might be worth holding off on the level up, drawing the extra card from one of your draw material deck cards, and then forcing your hand down to play this to destroy Scepter of Lumia, for example, because Scepter of Lumia will destroy this deck if you let it. So if you see it, I would just play this, get an extra card, play it, get rid of the Scepter, because it will mow you down before you have a chance to stabilize at 3. Alright, next up we have our flexible arcane picks. So we're running 3 of Erratic Bolt. Now, I've gone up on this card recently. I used to not be a massive fan of it, but it does give you the flexibility of drawing cards, which definitely, in some circumstances, you will need to draw the extra cards, and having more kill spells is never bad. However, it is a card that is a little bit more restrictive, as you do need the full base cost to play it anyway. So unless you have 6 cards in your hand, you can't hold on to anything when you play it. So it is a little more risky in that sense. But if you do have a lot of cards, this card's great. Fantastic. Next up is definitely a meta pick, which is Anger the Skies. Picking it because of the meta, lots of allies. Keep in mind that, well, we're only ever going to be dealing 4 damage because it's community players don't play the mage. So keep in mind that the damage that you're doing, 4 damage, is going to be enough to be stopped by a Song of Nurturing by most ally decks. Most ally decks are only running 2/3s, so 4 damage to a Song of Nurturing, it's going to really wipe the floor with you. If you're playing into a favorable wins, it's going to be really good. But if they have Song of Nurturing up in their hand, they've got 3 cards in their hand, probably expect them to play a Song of Nurturing. It's definitely something you need to try and catch them off guard with, and try and play and do at the opportune time, but it is pretty tricky to play around. Last up in the flexible arcane picks is Arcane Disposition. This card is a lot harder to play now. It used to be a lot easier with Reckless Conversion, where you could just put 3 down, draw 3, same Reckless Conversion, and you're already away laughing. However, I would say that now this is a card you've got to think about a lot more when you're playing it, and in fact, if you're very new to RAI, then I may not even recommend putting this in the deck. However, it is a really, really good value card as long as you can follow up the draw with playing something. You need to play something like a Peaceful Reunion that can stop your opponents from attacking, because keep in mind, the moment you play this card, you're not going to be able to interact at all with your opponent on their turn. No spell shields, no resolutes, no vanish from sights. So it's really, really important that you have something to follow this up. Next up, we're going to move into our sideboard. And first up, we have our Quicksilver plus Nullifying combo. This is because Erupting is a really, really bad matchup for us. Not to mention that Quicksilver can be used in many other ways, but Quicksilver Nullifying is the best way to give you maybe an extra turn, hopefully 2, against Erupting decks, because they will try and race you, and they'll often win that race. Next up, we have our Bauble Subouts. Now, in any deck that plays Baubles, I would always, always, always recommend having 2 cards that you can bring in for the 2 Baubles that you're not using. For example, if you're playing into a fire deck, you want to be able to bring out the wind and water Baubles and bring something in that's going to give you value, or at least have a chance to give you value. So we pick these because Tome of Knowledge obviously has the value of drawing you a card to ban if you banish it, but also just giving you an extra level, being able to bring out the Tome of Synchro Landing for free with it as well. It does cost 1, we don't have any floating, so you are going to have to banish something for it, but usually you can find something worth banishing, usually Arcane. And the other one is Mana Limiter. Mana Limiter is just another GCR with extra steps. I would keep in mind that you probably want to try and play this before your other ones. If you're ever in a situation where you want to play a draw card and you know you're going to be able to get to enough counters to play it, definitely do Mana Limiter instead, because the restriction of not being able to remove counters to draw can bite you in the ass. Alright, next up, this is a pick for the meta, filling out a Vanish from Sight. If I'm playing into an allies deck, I'm probably going to bring this in and remove a Spell Shield Arcane, mainly because the Spell Shield Arcane usually isn't going to be as prevalent as what it is to just hide and get an extra turn against allies. So this is what we use to kind of fill that out and just have a little more consistency against them. Next up is my not playing allies cards, and the first 2 are Pierre and Tamana. Pierre and Tamana is a card I'd really like to play in the main deck, but there just isn't space, and the deck is a little bit too slow to play it at the moment. It is definitely a card that you need to invest a turn into playing. There's not many times now where you can play this, draw a bunch of cards and go to a win. That normally would happen on Reckless Conversion turns. This was a really, really good card when Reckless Conversion was allowed, but we won't mellow on that too much. I would recommend bringing out Vanish from Sights for these, only because I prefer Peaceful a little bit just to stop hasty messenger attacks. Peaceful Reunions allow you to stop hasty messenger attacks, which is actually really important, so I would recommend for Merlins, at least, removing the Vanish from Sights, keeping the Peaceful Reunions in, because stopping their hasty messenger attacks can be really, really, really hurtful for them. Same for Erupting. Really good to have a Peaceful Reunion to stop hasties, because they really need that, and a lot of the Erupting now are playing hybrid, so being able to stop the firing momentums entirely is really, really good. The other card that we bring in for the other Vanish from Sight is just an extra copy of the Fractal. This is a very, very flexible spot, and you can actually put another Peaceful Reunion in here if you really want to, if there's a lot of allies decks, but I like having the extra consistency in those games where you're playing into Merlins or into Luxem Xanders, where you know that you're going to need to filter out some of the Resolutes and some of the Peacefuls, because you don't always need them against those decks, especially into Luxem Xander. You don't need any of them for the most part, so being able to cycle those, put them at the bottom, because the deck is built so much to stop allies because it's your worst matchup, being able to filter those out in those other games is really, really, really helpful. Alright, so that is my Fire Arcane RAI build. Let's see what Mercurial Heart brings, and we might be able to update this and add a little bit more spice, but for now, thanks for watching.